Stonehenge. Forget everything you may have heard. It is time for the truth, spiritual gateway, or something far more sinister.
Was Stonehenge a spiritual portal to another dimension? Or was it something far more nefarious? Join me as we explore Stonehenge together. Here we are, Stonehenge, probably one of the most famous ancient artefacts shrouded in mystery and superstition. There's lots of theories about who built it and why.
Stonehenge was a national meeting point 4,500 years ago.
But these are based on digging in the ground and putting together archaeological evidence. Is there another source of information that can reveal who built it? How was it built? And for what purpose? These are just some of the questions that I'm going to answer in this documentary, drawing upon higher information that cannot be found in books, and information that up till now has been hidden. I'm hopefully going to shed light on the mysterious druids who were involved with the building of Stonehenge. Who were they? What were they doing here? And importantly, I'm going to reveal Stonehenge's role and their role in a much bigger planetary picture. A picture which is literally out of this world. I'm Mark Zoretti, a spiritual teacher and author. I've got over 40 years of meditation experience, including advanced forms of meditation, and I've been lucky enough to experience levels of consciousness that are far beyond what we would normally consider the realm of the mind and the physical body. My pursuit to unravel the bigger picture has taken me in some surprising directions, and ultimately it's revealed itself to be the pursuit for the truth. Sometimes the information that I've gained on the inside has been at odds with what we generally understand from the mainstream education and sciences. Ultimately, I've come to accept that perhaps we can't know everything via the sciences alone, and maybe those things that are more mysterious need to be approached in a different way. I know how difficult it is to reconcile the tangible world with the more spiritual and mysterious world. Although I've been practicing meditation most of my life, I've also studied biology at university up to the level of a master's, and worked in the biotech and pharmaceutical sectors as well. Despite my scientific background, I've had experiences that simply cannot be explained by science alone. So I can appreciate that what I'm about to share with you may challenge some people's concept of the world around them. And that's okay, because there is never growth without challenging limits. In 2016, after over 10,000 hours of spiritual meditation, I discovered my ability to bring down higher knowledge. Since then, I've been producing podcasts, books, articles and videos to share what I've learned on the inside with seekers of truth. Time and again, the information I've found on the inside has been proven to be true, sometimes years later. Such spiritual knowledge is higher than anything we can gain with our senses down here on the third dimension. And as a spiritual teacher and sharer of information, I've decided that I will always speak the truth. Understandably, speaking the truth, especially speaking about spiritual truth, has provoked quite a few people, particularly those that do not want you to know the truth. But I decided that it is better to stand for the truth than to fall for deception. And so I promise you, I'm going to speak openly, honestly, and share all that I have learned about Stonehenge and the Druids. I do not want you to believe me. Instead, use this information as a starting point for your own exploration. Perhaps you'll discover even more. The good thing about the truth is that eventually the truth will always come out. My focus is spiritual, and I've got to be honest, I've never really been interested in such worldly affairs as Stonehenge or the Great Pyramids or the Nazca Lines and things like this. But in the research for my latest book, I discovered a shocking connection between the Druids of Stonehenge and a group of beings on higher dimensions who have been involved in the affairs of Earth for a very long time. So to help explain what I've discovered, I've driven all the way here to Stonehenge to explore more and to share with you on this journey. Who were the Druids? How did they build Stonehenge? What did they build it for? And is there a connection between Stonehenge, the Nazca Lines and Avebury? Stonehenge is in fact much older than we believe or understand. The original henge, which consists of the perimeter ditch and raised ground, was originally built approximately 9,700 BC. This included the Z and Y holes and the Aubrey holes, which had posts in them. Now, what is clear even today is that these posts and the holes allowed those people at the time to predict exactly when the summer and winter solstices would be. In effect, the original henge was a year clock, so that they could accurately know to the day when certain alignments were going to happen. Knowing this leads to an understanding of the original purpose of the henge. I say the original purpose because its purpose changed over time. What we need to ask ourselves is, why would someone thousands of years ago need to know the exact day of the year? When we consider life on Earth, on this physical plane, it's governed by basic needs, especially if we think back thousands of years to what it must have been like then. Warmth, shelter, security, food. When it comes to knowing what time of year it is, this really relates to agriculture. But early man would have been able to know when to sow seeds and when to reap the harvest. As the plants start to rise in spring, there would be clues. When the leaves start to fall off the trees in autumn, there is the clue that winter is coming. In other words, the reason for this year clock could not possibly have been for agriculture. It's far too accurate. They would have had enough clues from nature alone to determine when to grow the plants and when to harvest them. To understand why they needed this year clock, and remember, we're talking before the stones even existed, think about modern times. What is it that necessitates us knowing exactly what time it is, what day of the week it is, what month, etc.? If we did away with the calendar and clocks, we would still eat, we would still have shelter, we would still survive and thrive. The main reason we today have calendars and apps on our phones and things like this is to make sure that we're on time, specifically for meetings with others, or in the case of airports and transport, to be there when something departs or when something arrives. This is the reason why we have this quite staggering year clock. It's to allow people back then to be present at important meetings. The group who first established this henge and built the year clock were asked to do so by their leader. And it is because of this leader that my attention was drawn to Stonehenge. The name of this leader became known to me several years ago. And the group who established this monument behind me, known as Druids, are named after him. So when I learnt of his name, it drew my attention to the Druids, and that is why I'm here today. Not because I was interested in Stonehenge, but because I discovered who the leader is of the Druids. Now, if we were to go back 11,700 years, then the word Druid would be more accurately pronounced Druans, in homage to the name of this leader. And the reason he asked them to build this was so that he could come down and visit with them twice a year to give them instructions and guidance to carry out his will on the third dimension. This leader, who the Druids were named after, is ancient. In fact, he's older than humanity as you know them, and he's far older than what we recognise around us as this physical plane. Indeed, far older than Stonehenge and the Druids themselves. And despite being ancient, he's not all-knowing, he's not all-powerful, and he's not benevolent. This leader does not have humanity's best interests in mind. I have not named him in this documentary, and his name has never appeared in any of the ancient texts. There is hardly any reference to him, and you would not notice it if you saw it unless you knew. But his allies, who have helped him govern this, are well known, and some of their names may be familiar to you, including Pan, Lilith and Satan. This should leave you in no doubt as to his malevolence. So I've moved away from Stonehenge. I've come down this country lane that runs almost to the entrance to Stonehenge, and I've got a perfect view. I'm looking at it dead ahead of me now. Outside of the perimeter of Stonehenge, it's much easier to talk freely. There are so many tourists in there and guides and people milling about that it's very difficult to speak about these matters without kind of drawing attention, and that's why I've chosen to come away from Stonehenge a little bit, and this way I can talk more freely so that I can speak the truth and tell you more about what I've learned. The leader, as the Druids knew him, they didn't know where he was from. They believed he was from the stars, but he was actually on a higher dimension of Earth. And he would descend down to them to guide them twice a year at the winter and summer solstice, which was why they needed the year clock. He did this using what seems like very advanced technology to us, but was actually quite ancient technology to him. And he also used black magic. And the reason is that this technology and the ability to shift between dimensions isn't natural, and the black magic was needed in order to provide power and fuel for this interdimensional tunnel. The Druids would gather at the henge, and where the slaughter stone is, so you have the heel stone and then the slaughter stone, which kind of marks the gateway into the henge. The slaughter stone is so named because in ancient times, in the Stone Age, they noticed that there's a lot of iron ore in that particular stone, and so it rusts and appears to have blood. But the truth is that in the vicinity of that stone, at the entrance to the henge, these Druids would perform dark and black magic rituals, slaughtering animals, in order to generate a lot of ungodly and negative energy to correlate with the negative energy that the leader was using to create this tunnel. And so the leader would manifest this tunnel using his dark magic, and the Druids would contribute with the dark energy produced from the black magic that they were doing and the ritualistic slaughter of life. And the tunnel would open at the actual entrance by the slaughter stone. And the leader would walk out, and he would appear to them physical. So though he came from higher dimensions where he was non-physical, the process of coming down the tunnel would allow him to manifest into physical form, albeit not for a long period of time, but long enough to meet with the Druids. Now these meetings were obviously very important and were fundamentally about him giving the Druids instructions on how they can manipulate and control life on the third dimension. They didn't all live locally, and they came from different places to be here for this meeting, and he would instruct them on things like which families to trust, which to kill, where to conquer, where to attack, what to do in terms of planning for the future, organisations to create, secret or otherwise. It was about him using the Druids to consolidate his grip upon the third dimension and ultimately upon humanity, you and I. So this was the boss coming down to tell his management layer, right, this is what you need to do. And it was strategy, and it was planning, and it was all done in the shadows. Now he didn't always come himself. He wasn't just ruling the third dimension. This leader is actually the leader of much more than you or I could be aware of. And so sometimes he would send those closest to him in his stead. And one of those characters that he would send down was someone that goes by the name of Pan, although they have gone by many other names. And this is why Pan worship, which is the roots of paganism, arose amongst the Druids, because they recognized that this individual was very, very close to the leader, and this individual, as they have done on many occasions when they have come down to the third dimension under other identities, beguiled them and led them to believe that he was so important. The truth is that Pan, this individual, is actually the son of this leader, and that's why he was so trusted that he would come in his stead to rule over the kingdom of the third dimension plane, what we call Earth, what we call home. And as an aside, you may want to consider the word pandemonium or pandemon. Again, it lends to the fact that these beings or people were not coming down here for good reasons. They were not looking out for humanity. they came to control. So we're going to take a walk and see if we can go further around to the other side. Okay, so the question is, who were these Druids? They were actually a council of 12 representing the 12 different races that were aligned with the leader. It may be hard to comprehend, but the different animals represented in the constellations are actually stellar glyphs made out of stars representing these different races, for example, serpents, bears and lizards. And these 12 races that formed the Council of Druids are amongst those represented by these stellar glyphs. These glyphs represent all the different races that have an interest in the third dimension plane. So have you ever wondered why it is that the same animal glyphs and symbols that are featured in the constellations are also repeated, for example, in the Nazca lines and in petroglyphs around the world? Most ancient races and indigenous tribes often have in their ancestry story folklore references to mythical animals or almost godlike animalistic beings that are either their founders or played an important role in the establishment of their tribes. For example, the serpents of Australia and the wolves of Rome. Perhaps it's easiest to understand these stellar glyphs or petroglyphs in terms of them being flags marking territory. So for example, wherever you find the serpent either built into rocks or in the Nazca lines or in the constellations in the night sky, this is marking that particular territory as this belongs to the serpents. Now, 3 of the members of the Druid Council actually belong to a similar root race. And these 3 races were all much more technologically advanced than the others in the group. But since they were in an alliance, they shared their technology. And it was this technology that was used eventually in the formation of Stonehenge. These 3 races actually went on to form the major civilizations in Egypt and Mesopotamia. And that's why there as well you see these megalithic ancient structures that quite frankly belie belief as to how they were constructed. But they use the same technology and the same techniques as was being refined here. So you may wonder why these 3 races were so technologically and scientifically advanced. And to answer that, you actually have to go back to BC 16,000. At that time, one of these races came down to what we call Earth, the physical plane, and established 5 research sites. 2 of which are extremely well known. One of them, perhaps you've heard of, was Atlantis. The other one was Hy Brasil. Now there they developed technology over thousands of years that by our standards is way advanced of anything that we know in the mainstream. It was actually the leader of that race on higher dimensions who destroyed Atlantis and sunk it into the ocean. He did so because he was outraged that his researchers that he'd sent down from higher dimensions to the physical plane were sharing some of the knowledge of their technology with the humans that were there. And so he, in a fit of rage, wiped out Atlantis and killed off pretty much all of the humans there. Now he did this by using his power on higher dimensions to manifest what appeared to be a natural disaster on the physical plane. Now this isn't the only time this has ever happened, and there are quite ancient disaster stories that are well documented about floods, for example, where such apparently natural phenomena have actually been instigated from higher dimensions. A few of the researchers at that site were forewarned of what was going to happen and managed to escape, taking with them the knowledge of the technology that they had developed. So they actually escaped in what would best be described as flying craft. But these craft could not only fly, but they had the ability, based on technology that they had developed while on the physical plane, they had the technology to raise in vibration, and so they were able to not only escape the disaster on the 3rd dimension, but return to their original dimension, which is a much higher dimension. And this is how this technology that was developed 16,000 BC was able to be used in the construction of Stonehenge, because those races were now allied with the leader. One of the technologies they had learned and were now able to share was the creation of interdimensional tunnels. There's so much more that could be said about Atlantis and Hy-Brasil and what happened. And in the book I do go into a lot more detail, but the problem is that Hy-Brasil and Atlantis are no longer present for us to study and to observe. And so they could be dismissed simply as fanciful imagination or fairy tale. But when you have something like Stonehenge that actually physically exists and dates back thousands of years, then what you have is irrefutable proof of something. And what Stonehenge really represents is a crossover point between the reality that we understand down here as the third dimension and the physical plane, and a vaster reality that's happening even now on higher dimensions. And this is a pinch point, if you like, where at some point, at least in the past, the two have crossed. Even if the concept and idea of life and existence on higher dimensions that are beyond most people's awareness is too hard to swallow, is too big a leap for people. These giant stones that weigh over 25 tons, and similarly the Great Pyramids of Giza and the stone walls of interlocking, perfectly engineered stones at Sacsayhuaman in Peru, all point to some greater mystery. The mainstream theories about how these things were crafted and built seem woefully inadequate. So Stonehenge, like other ancient relics, point to the fact that there are perhaps mysteries that are beyond the explanation of the mundane and the everyday, that perhaps the mainstream is not able to answer. And if nothing, just the sheer size and the presence of such a phenomenon on the planet inspires some kind of deeper inquiry into what is going on. And so while it is easy to dismiss Atlantis and Hy-Brasil, we cannot dismiss Stonehenge because it is there, present and tangible, leaving the door open to a deeper inquiry. So going back to a time when the henge was first created, before these big stones were put in, this whole land would have been surrounded by lush woodlands, and the small stakes and smaller standing stones would not have been visible. In fact, it would all have been obscured. So when I first arrived a couple of days ago at the Stonehenge campsite, I wanted to experience what it might have been like for people thousands of years ago to come across this giant construction. And so I walked from the campsite for several hours through fields and across footpaths and bridleways. And it was only when I was maybe a mile away, just to the south, that I could actually see it, and it was small. And furthermore, because the path undulated up and down, when I carried on, it disappeared from view again. And if you take into account the trees that would have been there, what it suggests is that this structure was not built as a gathering place, a beacon for humanity to gather in celebration. Anyone capable of stacking stones like that could have easily have created something much higher than the surrounding trees. They could have chosen a location that was easier to see. They could have lit a fire on top, but there's no evidence of any of that. So clearly this was something built for a purpose that was not for the masses. Stonehenge was for its druid keepers and its leader, and it was a secret site. For the next 700 years, the leader and the council on the third dimension would meet twice a year at the solstices. He would give them instruction and they would follow. Obviously those down here would not live as long as him, and so they would pass on the title to the next one in their bloodline if he approved. And so their secret ways, their teachings, their black magic and their druid lore was passed on down the bloodlines, and the tradition of the druids and the purpose of meeting with the leader was preserved. Now this went on for 700 years, and that may seem like a long time, but to the leader it is nothing. And so for 700 years he would come down and rule over this council, and they in turn would rule over the lands that they controlled.
There was so much more I wished to share with you, but heavy rain came down, forcing me to stop. I was, however, able to capture this moody sunset time lapse since my GoPro is waterproof. But with a tight schedule and even more heavy rain predicted for the following day, it seemed our window for filming at Stonehenge was over.
Good morning. So, I'm just sorting out breakfast. It's a particularly wet and wild day today. And yesterday we were at Stonehenge. The plan for today, I've just been checking the map on my phone, is to go up to Avebury. I've also been looking at the weather and it doesn't look good. But we will not be deterred. I wasn't going to say anything about this really. This isn't something I intended to discuss in this documentary, but I think it is highly relevant. I film on a GoPro, just a really simple, easy to use camera, practically bomb proof. I mean, these things get attached to motorbikes and BMXs and thrown down the side of mountains. They're waterproof, they're drop proof, and there's really just one button: start recording, stop recording. And I've used the GoPro I have for quite some time, kept in very good condition, and I know it well. And I have a very basic audio recording device. Yesterday I started introducing some rather unsavoury characters. The leader, original druids, and the ones on higher dimensions that they're all aligned with. And I also talked about things like black magic and the use of black magic to allow these characters to move between dimensions. Maybe this is getting ahead of ourselves in this documentary, but it's relevant and I'll mention it now. This still goes on to this day. Now, what I found is when I talk to camera, I've done a lot of videos and I've done a lot of public presentation, and it comes easy. I normally know what I want to say and it comes out without lots of pausing and kind of brain fog. Now, when I arrived at Stonehenge yesterday, in the morning it was nice and clear, there was no one there, and it was very misty but beautiful. So here I am at Stonehenge. I've arrived quite early and you can just see it there in the background, and it's a very misty day. I had to wait till 9:30 till the park opens, and then I moved my van round to the public, kind of the main car park, paid my money and came in with the camera equipment. From that moment forwards, I really struggled. It was like there was some kind of an oppressive presence or force trying to give me brain fog, and so I really had to kind of keep going back to my notes, which is not like me at all. When I look back at the footage, I'm thinking, yeah, the stuff I said is all relevant, but the way I was talking was very kind of staccato and very suppressed. But what really clinched it for me was that I actually had to stop recording. And I said yesterday that I left the park because there were too many people and I wanted to take a step back and be more free to speak. That's true, but there was another reason. The camera itself was just locking up. It was not behaving, it wouldn't stop recording, it wouldn't start recording. When I had stopped it, I couldn't start it again. I changed the batteries, I switched it off, reset it. It was like it was being interfered with, and the word interference, in the work I do, this comes up a lot, and it's a way of referring to when a person or an object is being messed with by things unseen, and you could label it as magic or spells or pulls or hexes or black magic or any of these things, but really it just means that in some way something intangible, something that we can't necessarily understand on the physical, is being done to mess with said person or object. So I left Stonehenge, came back to the van, and in the peace and quiet of my van I was able to, in the same way I get information that I'm sharing with you in this documentary, I was able to find out what had been done and remove these blocks and these, let's just call them curses, upon the equipment. And then the GoPro started working fine. And since I've been here, I've noticed, the lights in the van will start flashing inexplicably and things like this. I was out walking the dog in the night, because I sometimes like to, just before going to bed, give the dog a walk and stretch both of our legs. And I heard something whoosh over my head. Probably only 2 or 3 meters above, but it didn't sound like a drone, it didn't sound like a craft that I recognised, it didn't sound like an animal. It had a very unusual, almost electrical sound to it. Now, I've got no idea what it was. I couldn't see anything. It was a clear night sky. I've never experienced that before. There's definitely something going on here. Whatever it is, it seems to be that they do not want this video to be made, which just spurs me on even more. So whether the weather is seemingly against us or whether there are forces seemingly against us, I am absolutely devoted to speaking the truth, and I will not be stopped from speaking the truth. I know some of this maybe sounds completely crazy. If I'd heard myself speaking these things or someone else talking like this years ago, I probably would have dismissed them as a whack. And I think that's partly how we've been conditioned to think about people that speak up about things that are maybe not mainstream, is we're too quick perhaps to label them as either a wacko or a conspiracy theorist. But if you'd walked the journey that I've walked over the last 20 plus years, you'd probably be sitting in this seat saying the same things that I am. We need to open our minds. We need to, maybe mind isn't the right word actually there, but we need to be more conscious and perhaps less reactive. But it's in that stillness of observing rather than reacting in terms of intellect and habit and thought and prejudice and all of these things. But it's in that stillness where we can have an inquiry into the nature of things. So the plan for today is we're going to go up to Avebury and we're going to look at the stones there, which I can tell you now is going to be, it's quite interesting why they're there, what their purpose was, and it ties in with Stonehenge.
As I said, and as you'd seen on my sat-nav, the plan was indeed to head straight to Avebury, as time was limited. But as I left the campsite, though it was still raining, I saw this amazing rainbow. Ignoring the weather forecast, which was for non-stop rain, I followed my intuition and instead of heading to Avebury, I went in the other direction, back to Stonehenge. Though it was very cold, sure enough, as I arrived, the sun broke through the clouds, providing an unexpected chance to share with you what the rain had prevented the day before.
Okay, we've had a fortunate break in the weather, so I've returned to Stonehenge and you can just see it's way off in the distance there. It's actually less than half a kilometre, but it gives you an idea of how small it really is in the grand scheme of things. Why? After 700 years of using the year clock to organise and coordinate their biannual meetings with the leader, why did the Druids then place these megalithic stones in the ground? What had changed? Well, in order to answer this, you need to understand that the council on the third dimension, these 12 Druids that governed different lands and would congregate here twice a year, was part of a much bigger chain of command. In fact, these 12 were the lowest rung of the ladder. There is another council of 12 on a much higher dimension, and even higher up than them is another council of 12, and above them a third council of 12. So this was the lowest of 4 rungs, and above all of them is the leader. Affairs on Earth had evolved quite considerably. There was much more interest in humanity as things were evolving and in the third dimension. And so the leader was increasingly having to give his attention on higher dimensions to govern things there as well. And with this chain of command, although the third dimension and humanity were the primary focus of his manipulation and control, he needed to delegate. Now, with the exception of Pan and 1 or 2 others, who he really trusted because they were either directly in his bloodline or had proven their loyalty, he didn't want to give the technology that he used on himself and allow Pan to use to those others. This technology that he used allowed him in person, without the aid of craft or anything, via black magic to come down via these interdimensional tunnels. That's extremely powerful technology, so he wasn't about to hand it over to people that he didn't trust so well. So he said to his generals and those that were going to start governing the third dimension in his stead, if you're going to go down there, you'll do it my way. You're not going to have this personal technology, you're going to use craft. And he turned to those 3 races who were represented by some of the Druids down here, who were the extremely technologically advanced ones, having also been involved with Atlantis. And he leveraged his alliance with them to gain access to their flying craft technology. And so it's actually the craft that were used to escape from the destruction of Atlantis circa 12,000 BC that were actually employed to bring his delegates down to this site so that they could run the biannual meetings and help govern the third dimension with the Druid Council. So what we're looking at when we look at Stonehenge is actually an interdimensional airport. And the stones were necessary infrastructure to support the arrival and departure of these interdimensional craft. So how did they construct this? This is one of the biggest points of speculation. Did they drag these 26-ton stones on rollers across undulating fields and through woods? It seems far-fetched, really. Now, this stone part of the construction was done about 9000 BC, much earlier than actually is believed. When you go through the tourist place and they show you the timelines, Stonehenge seems much younger than that. Therefore, at 9,000 years BC, it predates the pyramids, it predates the Sacsayhuaman stone walls and all the other megalithic structures. And what we're actually looking at is the precursor to all of those structures. The technology that they used to cut these stones and move these stones would go on to be used to do the Egyptian pyramids, among other things. And remember, it's the same druids, the same races involved who were in Atlantis, who lent their technology to provide the craft to come down to Stonehenge, who would then go on to establish the Egyptian pyramids. So there is this connection between all of these different myths, legends, and things that are physically tangible. The technology they actually used were these devices which they would attach to a rock, and then once they activated it, it would cause it to vibrate and shift in vibration until it levitated, and then it could just be pushed along. But in order to activate them, it required a lot of energy, and not the kind of energy that you would normally find in nature. And so they used black magic to draw down really dark and evil energy from higher dimensions, as well as to produce it there and focus it into these devices. And so just as the interdimensional tunnels were technology based, they were also black magic based. And when we talk about black magic, what we're really talking about is very, very evil and dark. And this is really why a lot of the lore and legend of magic associated with Stonehenge should really be approached with caution. Because all magic ultimately is an attempt to interfere with or go against nature. So there weren't hordes of horses and men and rollers and all of these things. It was very, very simple. But before they could move these boulders, they had to cut them. They didn't just find all of these perfectly rectangular boulders. And when you look closely at these rocks, they've got tongue and groove joints, they've got pegs, they've got holes. All of these features were hewn from the rock using another device. It was similar technology. Again, it worked on sound vibrations. You had this device that you attached to a hard stone. Carve this hard stone in the usual way using hand tools to make a sharp blade. And then you would attach this resonating device to it, and it would cause it to vibrate, and those vibrations would allow it to cut through stone almost as easy as a knife through butter. And so that's how they were able to shape all these stones with ease. And then once they cut them, they could then levitate them and just push them along to arrive at their destination. And this is exactly how the Egyptian pyramids were built. With the Egyptian pyramids, they were travelling over sand a lot of the time, so they had to pour water down to solidify the sand. But it was really quite straightforward. Now, to us, this seems like ridiculously advanced technology, but life on higher dimensions is ancient. And so they were doing this 12,000 years, 14,000 years BC in Atlantis. And this is why we can't understand, or we speculate that they carved these rocks using bronze tools and dragged them across the ground. I don't know which is more far-fetched. The idea that there might be more to life than just this, and that there may be ancient technologies, which are after all depicted in petroglyphs and hieroglyphs across the world, or that somehow people managed to drag these rocks tens or hundreds of miles using just brawn and rough rope. You decide. So why have they built the infrastructure the way it is? You have a circle of sarsen stones, and then within that you have the trilithons, which are the taller sarsen stones with the caps across the top. The sarsen stone circle itself had the capstones as well. Now these two parts are the key infrastructure to do with bringing in the craft and allowing the craft to leave. But they also still needed a way of tracking the day so that they knew when the meetings would be. And at this point, with these big stones in place, the Aubrey holes and the Y and Z holes and posts were quite outdated and harder to spot because of all these other stone structures. And so what they then put in place was the blue stones to act as the markers for the year clock. They'd upgraded their system. They then started using the north and south barrows as elevated posts from which they could act as sentries to make sure that no one was in the stone circle when it needed to be used, and also to get a better view, because once they'd elevated the site using stones, they needed to have points of elevation from which they could perceive with ease. So why this open horseshoe, open into alignment with the heel stone, and then the surrounding ring, which is slightly lower? It doesn't make sense when you look at it from the ground, but imagine coming in on a craft down the avenue in a direct line with the heel stone into the horseshoe. The horseshoe is elevated and it's to do with the trajectory of the craft. These craft didn't drop down, they came in, because they came from higher dimensions, swung around as they dropped in vibration, and then came on a very specific trajectory as they exited the wormhole, over the Heelstone and into the horseshoe. And so they had to be able to fly over the outer ring of stones and come into the horseshoe to rest, which is why the outer stones are lower than the horseshoe. But there's something really important that we need to understand. If you bring energy from a higher dimension down to the third dimension, it's dangerous. It's at a much higher vibration, it's much more kind of potent. It's not meant to be here. Now, we experience that kind of energy occasionally, and it is basically radiation, although often it's made by using technology on the third dimension to release energy that is not meant to be experienced on the third dimension, and that's when we have very kind of harmful forms of radiation. But when these craft come down, they're using high dimensional energy, just as the black magic that the Druids were using to draw down ungodly energy. Now, not all higher dimension energy is bad. There's a lot of good, but it's not meant to be down here. You're not meant to bring that energy down. In the case of the craft, though, the energy they were using was bad as well, so it's even worse. And so when the craft arrived, it would bring with it almost like an aura of higher dimensional energy, and it would also be using ungodly energy as its form of propulsion. And this explains why we have the outer ring of stones. That is a protective shield to protect the Druids who are waiting for the arrival of the leader or the leader's envoy from this radiation. Under the guidance of the leader, they had imbued that outer ring with black magic to form a domed perimeter of energy lines made out of dark energy. And what that did is it contained all of that radiation. If they hadn't done that, they would have been burnt, much like someone that, say, has been out in the sun for too long and they literally get sunburnt. As an aside, you may want to ponder, why is it that if we evolved supposedly on this planet under that sun, why does it burn us if we get exposed to it too much? That's worth considering. But that's way beyond the scope of this particular documentary, but I will be explaining it in the books. But coming back to this, the outer ring is a protective field so that the radiation of the craft does not leak out and harm the Druids and anyone else there, all of whom were bad, but they still didn't want to harm them because they were in alliance with the people coming down. Now, once the craft was down, eventually it would have to leave. Just as landing uses less energy than taking off in an airplane, it needed a lot of energy to get from the third dimension off the ground and back to the higher dimensions. And this is the reason for the inner horseshoe. It's not just there to kind of act as a marker for where to land. It was also imbued with dark magic and energy grids around it so that it could be used by the occupants of the craft when they were ready to leave. They would get back into their craft when it was time to go, and they would invoke powerful dark magic to draw down demonic, ungodly energy from a massive reserve that they had created on higher dimensions. And this energy would stream into this horseshoe and be contained by the field set up by these energy grids. And the craft would draw it in to power itself so that it could then leave and return to the higher dimensions. Now, this is really ungodly energy, very nasty stuff. And the stones would contain it, and when the craft had gone, any residual radiation, any residual ungodly energy would be absorbed into the stones and into the ground, and most of it would eventually dissipate. But this is one of the reasons. What we've got to understand is these races that were here to manipulate humanity, to control humanity, subdue us, to keep us in the dark, they weren't good. But all of this bad energy that would accumulate, partly through their black magic and through the arrival of the craft, was actually nourishing to them, because they themselves were bad. What they were doing was bad. So for them, the kind of residual energy that would permeate the ground and radiate outwards was actually supportive. The negativity made them feel good. And this is one of the reasons why there's this idea about the healing properties of Stonehenge. At each solstice, the leader would send lots of dark energy down to Stonehenge, because he knew that his servants, those that he was controlling, those who were doing his work, would gather there. And this energy, it was like just how you feel when perhaps you go on holiday and you buy a waterfall and it's like, oh, this is beautiful and uplifting. For them, being dark, this outpouring of dark energy upon that place was healing and cathartic. And the healing for them was real, because those who have turned away from the light cannot be healed by the light, but they could get nourishment and feel revitalized, in their bodies, which are the lowest part of them, would also benefit. This reservoir of ungodly energy on higher dimensions was actually managed and maintained by one of the higher councils, because they were collaborating with what was happening on the third dimension. So they would know that there were craft coming, they would know when to build up the energy reserves to allow this kind of interdimensional transportation. Now, just to give you an idea of how different these craft are to what we're familiar with, like flying aeroplanes and helicopters and balloons and stuff like this. To get from the higher dimension where they left and to arrive here was about a 2-minute journey. And it's really understandable why people might think of these things as UFOs. I'm going to talk about how their propulsion systems actually worked and how they jumped between dimensions. But they were disc-shaped. The archetypal original idea of a UFO was a saucer or a disc. But they were not UFOs. They were interdimensional craft coming from Earth on a higher dimension to Earth on a lower dimension. The idea that we are one of many, many planets floating through space, being visited by UFOs from other planets and other galaxies and other systems, has been deliberately encouraged and propagated to hide the truth. These aren't visitors from another planet. These are visitors from this planet. But if people understood that, if people knew about higher dimensions, then they would start to inquire in that way, and the truth would become known. But the leader and his councils do not want humanity to know the truth. So to cover up any awareness of these craft, the idea that these craft come from other planets has been propagated. The UFO ideology is a huge distraction. They're not visitors from another planet. But if everyone's looking out across the heavens to other planets, and no one's looking up at what's happening on this planet, then we'll all stay in the dark. And so this is why the UFO arena, which is fascinating, is becoming so mainstream and so, if you like, it's another hoax, it's another smoke and mirrors. So going back 9,000 BC, interdimensional craft from higher dimensions of Earth started landing here, bringing envoys of the leader to teach, lead and guide the council on the third dimension. So why were they saucer shaped? This is all to do with the form of interdimensional shifting they used. Within each of these craft, in the very centre, was a vortex generator. And what energy vortexes do, which is very similar if you know anything about energy systems in your own body, if you know about chakras, they take energy from higher vibrations and they slow it down to drop it in vibration, or they can speed it up to raise it in vibration. So on higher dimensions, they would activate the downward vortex and take off. Rapidly, they would drop in vibration, and as they arrived at Stonehenge, they would have shifted the vibration of the craft and the occupants to what I call pseudo-physical. They would be at the same vibration, for example, as this fan, but they wouldn't be permanently physical. It would be a temporary sort of physicality. But it was enough that they could interact with the people on the third dimension and interact with the environment around them. And when they were ready to go, they would flick the vortex to the upward vortex, and that would rapidly raise the vibration of them and the craft they were in, shifting them. And at the same time, they would take off and leave, and by the time they were over the Heelstone and out of sight, they would have disappeared anyway, because they would no longer be visible, because they had shifted out of the third dimension's range, and they'd arc back round and return to their higher plane. It's unbelievable, and yet this is what has been going on for thousands and thousands of years. So the reason why the craft is saucer-shaped is because the outer rim of the vortex is a circle emanating from this central point. So if you have a central point and you draw a circle around it, you have a saucer or a dish shaped. And the field wasn't flat, and therefore the shape of the craft was to mirror the shape of the vortex. That way all of the craft is within the vortex and everything gets shifted. Hi, I hope you didn't mind me pausing the documentary at this point. It's been several weeks since I did this filming, and I've been spending this time editing the documentary, and I realised that some of the things I'm describing are perhaps quite difficult to visualise, and that 3D models would help, for example, of Stonehenge. You've already seen some of these models in the documentary, and there are many more to come. But there's something I wanted to explain. It's quite important. And I couldn't really do so at the beginning. But now that you've got more context, now that you understand that there are higher dimensions and that there are beings on higher dimensions, then what I'm going to share with you now will make more sense. And what it is I want to go into more detail about how it is I actually get the information. But importantly as well, I'd like to give you more of an insight into the process. When I was about 7 years old, I started meditating, and it was all done naturally and intuitively. In fact, I didn't even know the word meditation. I was just closing my eyes and going inside. By about the age of 12, I'd had some pretty profound realizations and experiences on the inside. And after many, literally thousands and thousands of hours of meditation and dedication, by 2009 I attained a state which many people refer to as enlightenment. Now, the word enlightenment is often used, and it means different things to different people. So let me explain a little bit more about what I mean when I say enlightenment. In that final meditation, my consciousness transcended all limits, going beyond the bounds of time and space and vibration, to that great oneness, if you like. And my spirit, again, transcended the boundaries of everything and returned to the source. Now, this physical body and all that you see is no different than it was before that. It's a vehicle for what happens down here. But it means that from that point on, when I go on the inside, I'm able to have awareness that transcends time, transcends space. And for most people, that realization of enlightenment, because I'm not the first to do this, that realization is considered the end of the journey. But one of the things I understood at that moment was that this was the beginning for me. And so I continued exploring and learning how to go into that greater state. And because it is beyond time and beyond boundaries and limitations, then anything that has ever happened, anything that has ever been known, any event that has ever occurred, is within that greater state of being. And as such, after many, many more years, I learned that I could go inside and get information about what has happened in the past, because from that greater state, which is beyond time, there is no such thing as the past. And so all knowledge is effectively there, and what I was learning was how to access it. Now, when I first started doing this, I encountered beings on higher dimensions. And just as down here on the third dimension, some people are good, some people are not so good. I soon realised that it was the same on higher dimensions as well. And some of them tried to mislead me and give me false information, but I soon realised that was happening. And because of this vast estate, which they don't have, I was able to go beyond that limit that they presented and to know the truth. And so, though in the beginning I could interact with these higher beings and get information from them, some good, serving the light, and some trying to mislead me, I soon realised that I didn't need to, and I could go beyond even the limits that they knew and know whatever it was that needed to be known. But it was in discovering these beings on higher dimensions and realising that not all were good that I came across the leader, and in time discovered the information about his druids, information that he did not wish me to know. But having access to knowledge is not the same as knowing how to access it. And so the skill that I have learned over many more years is how to have that inquiry. So this gives you a little bit more of context and awareness of how it is that I'm able to get information, even if it is ancient and even if it is hidden. But as I've alluded to, the real skill is in accessing it. All this information is like a vast, almost endless puzzle. Each fragment of information is a puzzle piece. You don't simply get all of the knowledge if you want to know something. The skill is in knowing how to pursue it. And so you start with an inquiry, and that brings forth a fragment of information. And then with experience, I've learned how to follow the thread. That piece leads to that piece, leads to that piece, and eventually a bigger picture starts to emerge. But the information is neutral, it's just there. And so it's the pursuit of truth that matters, because truth and light go hand in hand, and it is through pursuing truth that light is shed upon the information to bring it to light. And sometimes I've been guided by those who serve the light on higher dimensions, who've brought certain bits of information to my attention so that I can look into it further. Over the course of many years of doing this, I've gathered a mass of information, and it's this bigger picture putting together all these puzzle pieces that are in the books, as well as the describing the process and the unfolding realizations that have led to this. And the documentary that we're looking at here is but a small fragment of this bigger picture. So bringing it back to this documentary, when I decided that I was going to make these 3D models, at that point we knew that there were craft that could travel between dimensions. And so in order to make the models, I needed to know what they looked like, how many crew were in them, how they were powered, and all of these things. Because truth matters, and I wish to represent the truth as accurately as possible, when I realised, having already filmed much, that I needed to go inside and bring more information down, it brought up a lot more about the craft. And so what I'd like to invite you to join me in is we're going to pause this video here and jump forwards in time. Tomorrow I'm going to return to Stonehenge so that I can share this new information that has come about through the process of making these 3D models about the craft and how they looked and how they functioned in much more detail. And then we'll return to where we are now. Here we are, back at what is quite a sunny day at Stonehenge, and there it is. It's about -2 today, so there's a few people less than last time we were here. But I've come back because, as I explained, since I did the last bit of filming, we found out even more information, and that draws our attention to the stones, which by now we understand to be an interdimensional spaceport, like an airport really.
As you could hear, it was an extremely windy day and it was just not possible to carry on filming. I'd have to wait till the following day. So I made use of the time in the van to do some more editing of this documentary.
Good morning. Well, another sunny day. It was about, let them go past. It was about -8, -9 last night. But it's a gorgeous sunny day. So I think it's time to walk the dog and then we're going to do some filming. Are you ready? Come on then, to me. Let's go. There you go. Yeah, come here. Want to go for walkies? Okay. Good boy. I'm back here to talk specifically about the craft, so let's recap what we understand so far. Well, it's never a dull moment, it seems, at Stonehenge. We're just going to head off now. The police have just come along. They're closing this road and asking everyone to move. Okay, so here we are yet again, back at Stonehenge. We had to move location because the police and the council came and closed the entire site. It was a public road, but they shut it down because literally in a week is the winter solstice, and they're expecting a lot of people to turn up there, so they've decided to close that road altogether, which is fair enough. Now we're here specifically to focus on the craft. Let's first recap what we know so far. It creates a vortex, so it's got a vortex generator, and that allows it to shift in vibration, and it also has the need for very dark and ungodly energy, and that's what is used to power it. So let's take a closer look. I mean, imagine what would it look like if it was here right now, today, coming out from the actual Stonehenge as it is today. It's certainly very golden, that's the first thing you notice. Now with the craft above us, the first thing that really stands out is underneath it there appear to be 6 thruster-like objects. This is how the craft was 9,000 BC, 11,000 years ago. Since then there's been a lot of other types of craft, and some have more thrusters, some have less, but this is actually how these original craft were, with 6. But there's nothing significant about that number in this particular case, it's just the way that these craft were built. We'll talk some more about the thrusters in a bit. Now if the craft were to drop down and lean towards us slightly, then we'd be able to see, as you can see now, that there is a domed windscreen across the top, and that too has a golden tint to it. And we can start to make out within it there is an orb at the top of the windscreen, dead central to the craft, and there is also an orb within the centre of the craft, and these are 2 of the key features that I wanted to discuss with you in more detail. But first, why is it that the craft and the windscreen are golden? Well, the windscreen is actually impregnated with golden particles all the way throughout its surface. The craft itself is also coated in gold. Now in the book I talk a lot more about the material and spiritual significance of gold and its role in the bigger picture. Suffice to say at this stage that the use of gold in this craft is not positive. It is something quite nefarious. And there is no coincidence either that, if you remember back to when the leader was introduced, the leader was shown wearing a gold cloak. Gold is used a lot by the ungodly. But let's go back to the spheres that we could see. Let's take a closer look. In the centre of this craft, if we zoom right in, we will see the actual vortex generator. Now this is encased in a dodecahedron containment system, and this is made out of a very complex metal alloy which has a single leg attached to the base of the craft. In each of the node points of this dodecahedron is a field emitter, and these create a spherical field to contain the vortex emitter. The vortex emitter itself is that very bright centre. It's called the emitter core, and that's at the very centre. And you'll notice that rotating around it are 2 spheres, but they are incomplete, and they are made of almost square sheets of a very metallic alloy, and they are rotating in different directions to each other, and the gaps in these spheres allow the operators of the craft to regulate the vortex by allowing more or less of the energy to emanate from this core. So that whole system is effectively a containment and regulation system for the vortex emitter, which is the bright core at the centre. And it's from this centre that the vortex is emitted outwards. And as you can see, it arches up, round, and comes back in. And if you were to look at it from above, it would seem almost like a toroid. And though a toroid has a hole in the centre, the way this field works is the entire craft, including the centre bit, is encased in almost like the silhouette of the field. So although it comes back in, it loops round again and creates this overall containment field. And everything within this field is shifted in vibration, including the field emitter, the craft, the personnel within, when the vortex is activated, either shifting it up or shifting it down. Now, shifting in vibration is one thing, and say the craft was on a higher dimension and they shifted in vibration, they would have changed vibration, but they would still be stuck on that higher dimension. So this craft is nothing without its propulsion system. And so we draw our attention to the orb at the top, the one that's in the windshield. Now I'd like to be able to tell you what it's called, but the interesting phenomena about how information comes down is that you don't necessarily get the names of things, rather you get the nature of them. So I understand what it is, I understand how it works, but it is a completely different kind of inquiry to be able to get the label or the name that someone else would have used for it in the past. So for this purpose, we'll simply call it the gravity drive. And what that orb is doing is it's creating, just above the craft, a gravity well, which we can now see. Now you wouldn't normally see the gravity well because it's a distortion in the fabric of space. It wouldn't necessarily be visible to your eye, but you can see it there. And the way it works is this gravity well is like you could think of it like a black hole. It's not a black hole, but that's probably the easiest way to understand it. Because it's above the craft falls upwards into the gravity well. But because the well is being emitted by the craft, then as the craft falls upwards, the well moves as well. And so they keep sync with each other, and the craft rises. And they can change the angle that this gravity well is projected at so that they can go upwards and forwards or backwards or sideways in any direction. And if they want to descend, they simply weaken the gravity well and there is less falling upwards, and they then are influenced by the gravity of the environment they are in and they fall down. Now when we talk about gravity, the phenomena of gravity certainly does exist. If you were to sit under a tree and an apple fell out, it would hit you on the head. But the theories and explanations of gravity that we have at this time differ from how these ancient and far more technically advanced races would understand gravity. First of all, they understand the multi-dimensional nature of the fabric of creation. They're not just looking at everything in terms of the physical plane. And they understand that what gravity is density. Now we can use the word density in two contexts. There's the density of matter around us, and this is why, for example, a fish will float in water because it is less dense. A submarine can rise or sink in the water by changing its density, by filling its ballast tanks with water or purging them of water. And so by changing the density of an object, it can rise or fall in water. That's also, from a higher perspective, why we land on the ground and why Stonehenge stays on the ground, because it's at the same density as the ground. If you took the stones up into the air, they would be much denser than the air and they would fall towards the more dense part of creation. And it's the same on all dimensions. So gravity does exist, but it's perceived as density, not some kind of weak, hard to prove, attractive force. It simply is that when the craft creates this gravity well above it, it's creating a denser place than the surrounding, and the craft being dense will attract to that density. It falls into it. So this gravity engine is the main propulsion system of the craft, and it's capable of allowing the craft to traverse the entire diameter of the physical plane in minutes. But what it's not very good at is finesse. This is a brute force drive. And if you were to rely on this gravity well, this attachment, if you like, to a gravity field, and try and land, you'd probably crash. And historically, there are some examples of things going wrong. To try and imagine why that would be, if you had a very heavy weight on the end of a bungee cord and you were swinging that bungee cord around, your hand would be the gravity well, and wherever you swing it, the heavy weight would be the craft, and it would be fine for making it move rapidly and then the elastic nature of the bungee cord would cause the craft to overcompensate. And so when you watch these craft, they're always in a state of movement because they're constantly falling into a gravity well and having to make adjustments. If they want to stay in one place, then they have to fall and then ease off the strength of the well to drop back. And so they can't easily stay in one place. And so manoeuvring down to land the craft on the ground just isn't possible. You'd end up crashing, as has happened. And so they devised the system of thrusters. And the thruster's job is primarily to decelerate as they come into land and control the fine movements to gently land the craft and then to take the craft off before the gravity well takes over and they rapidly move away. When we talk about thrusters, like me, you're probably thinking, was it solid fuel, liquid fuel, some kind of maybe electric drive or something? When I did the work to go inside and bring down the knowledge of how the thrusters worked, I've got to be honest, this was something that really surprised me, and not in a good way either. The first thing to consider or to understand is that energy on a much higher dimension, as I've said, should not be down here. And when it does come down here, it's much stronger. It's like it's potentized by coming down here. The second thing to understand is that emotions, and you may be wondering where I'm going with this, stick with me. Emotions are fundamentally a basic thought, not an intellectual thought, but a basic thought. And that thought would be, for example, I like, in which case there's a lot of positive feelings and emotion about attraction towards something. Or you might have the emotion of I dislike, in which case there's a repulsion, a sense of wanting to move away from something. And all emotions are fundamentally a thought with energy. Negative emotions like anger or hate tend to have negative energy, and positive emotions tend to have positive energy. But what they realised a long time ago is if they made some really, really evil, dark energy, something that should not exist, and they made it on a really high dimension and then brought it down to this dimension, it would become a powerful force. And then if they used it as emotional energy, then the thought within that emotion, for example repulsion, would direct the energy, because energy alone doesn't act. It needs a thought to compel it, if you like. And so what these thrusters are, those balls that we see, are actually balls of highly disgusting, evil, dark energy compressed. And within each one, they've been imbued with a abject thought of core basic repulsion. And so as the craft is coming in, the pilot can manipulate the amount of that emotional energy to cause repulsion. And so it's these drives pushing against their environment, literally the energy and the thought of repulsion from higher dimensions having a massive effect on the third dimension to effectively hold up this craft and allow it to be gently lowered to the ground. You could say it's pure genius, but it's also pure evil and darkness. And so if this sounds crazy, I assure you, you've probably already heard of this very principle. See, any time a picture falls off a wall or an object flies across a room or a door slams, in what people quite often term poltergeist activity, or when there's a presence in a house, that's psychokinesis. It's an emotional outburst causing movement of physical matter. That's what psychokinesis means. And these thrusters are actually psychokinetic thrusters. They're using abominable energy with a really intense negative emotion to thrust against the environment, literally repulsing everything around them. And if you were here with me right now, in close vicinity to this craft, you would probably experience a coppery, almost acidic taste on your tongue. And you might even feel a tingling in your crown chakra, in the back of your head. Some people might even notice a very unpleasant, pungent smell. And what this is the negative energy coming off that craft is being sensed. Because it's not a chemical, it's an emotion. It's picked up by your aura. and your system is trying to make sense of it. And it literally, if you're in the vicinity of something like this, the negativity coming off it will be experienced by you as taste or smell or sensations that are all letting you know this is really unpleasant, you need to move away. So with its psychokinetic thrusters and its anti-gravity system using a gravity well and a gravity drive and its interdimensional vortex generator, this craft is able to move between dimensions, to manipulate itself and maneuver itself on the physical plane as well as on higher planes, and to move at phenomenal speeds. And it's understandable, knowing all of this, especially if you're scientifically minded, that you'd be wondering if this could be replicated. And certainly in cutting edge fields right now, some of the technology that's involved in this craft is being explored. It might not be in reference to making an interdimensional craft, but people are already looking at wormholes, quantum tunneling, quantum computing, particle accelerators and all of these things. And by the way, I appreciate this is totally often well intended. And then in the fringe fields, people are looking at free energy devices, trying to tap into the mysterious black matter or antimatter that makes up the bulk of the cosmos, or trying to create 0 points to draw down or manifest energy. With the understanding of the multidimensional nature of creation, I can tell you, all of these activities, no matter how positive the intentions behind them are, no matter how good the people doing the research are, I'm not questioning their goodness or their motivation, but all of these scientific endeavours are fundamentally ungodly, because what they are doing is they are disturbing, breaking or distorting the fabric of creation, the dimensional fabric, to bring energy down that should not be here, or to create energy that should not exist. And this is exactly what these dark and evil beings figured out literally 18,000 years ago at Atlantis, and they've been refining it ever since. And whether it is that we are being manipulated as a society to bring these technologies to the third dimension at this time, or whether we're getting there by our own scientific prowess, is irrelevant. What we are discovering is ancient, and it should not exist. And on higher dimensions, I can tell you this much: those that serve the light do not use technology. There is no such thing as good technology. Craft are not meant to manipulate their environment and travel between dimensions. And that energy I talked about that they created on higher dimensions, to be able to create these balls of intense negativity and evil and darkness to use as thrusters, that should not exist. And so the work of these ungodly beings isn't just an abomination on the third dimension, it's an abomination on every single dimension. And whether we're doing it blindly or being guided, society is moving in that direction. And so it has to be said, we need to stop. Just because something can be done doesn't mean that it should be done. And those that serve the light on higher dimensions have made it very clear that they do not wish to see this technology being developed on the third dimension. So yes, this craft is fascinating, but the purpose for it must not be forgotten, and the ones who created it must not be forgotten. And they all are using these craft to come down here and to control you. They've been manipulating society for thousands of years. I do not believe it is a coincidence that we are now replicating or starting to learn how to replicate the technology that they have been using to enslave us all this time. Welcome back. Well, that was certainly fascinating, and it really gives an insight into how so much of what we maybe believe to be cutting-edge technology in our present day could actually have its roots not only in the ancient past, but perhaps even on higher dimensions. But let us return now to where we left off. The story at Stonehenge isn't quite finished, and after Stonehenge, I'm going to invite you to join me as we take a journey to Avebury, where there are even more revelations and insights, not only into our ancient past, but also into how things are the way they are in the present day. Now, you could actually touch the craft, but you would have had to enter into that perimeter, and you would have probably suffered quite badly from radiation. The occupants of the craft, however, they could come out, and because they were of a high vibration, they were from higher dimensions, their bodies and their form are meant to be exposed to higher vibrational energy, and so they didn't suffer any ill effect from the radiation, and they could come out, leave the craft, walk out of the kind of safety perimeter of the Sarsen Stone Circle, and then meet with the Druids, and that's exactly what would happen. Now, they would have about 10 hours from when they landed to when they had to leave. 2 reasons. Maintaining the vortex on the craft took a lot of energy, so 10 hours was about the maximum. And once they stepped out of that vortex field that was suppressing their vibration to drop it down to pseudo-physical, third-dimensional vibration, they would start the process of returning to their own vibration. Now, it wouldn't happen instantly, but if they stayed outside of that field for more than 10 hours, they would just start to fade. Now remember, they're not actually made of physical matter. They're made of energy and matter on higher dimensions. Their matter would start to return to its natural vibration. And if you were standing, say this is one of them, then they would just fade away. They wouldn't actually be gone, but you would no longer be able to perceive them. But they would now be in a bit of bother because they'd be stuck on this plane, but at the wrong vibration. So they had a maximum of 10 hours, and often they wouldn't stay even half of that. But they would do their work, talk about what needed to be done, go and attack that village, this person has to leave the group, design this technology, whatever the instruction was. And obviously they were always teaching them about magic and things like this, because a lot of the suppression is to do with thought, and a lot of the black magic they were doing and the circles and the stones and the work they did in nature was to actually set up negative energy grids around the planet. For the next 3,000 years, these biannual meetings carried on, visitors came down, and then again things were evolving on higher dimensions. And the leader and those really close to him like Pan, over this time they hadn't been standing still. Humanity was now evolving. We're coming up to about 6,000 BC. And you've got the rise of the Egyptian cities and Mesopotamia. And this was because 3 of those races that had been involved with this Druid council had broken ranks and set up their own cities in defiance of the leader. They had gained power on higher dimensions as well. Suddenly, there was much more conflict between these ruling races on higher dimensions. And there had always been conflict between many of the other races, of which there are many. Earth was the prize. And in this pursuit of governance and rule, the leader had developed a vast array of knowledge, all of which was dark. Black magic, mind control, thought control, manipulation, technologies and energies that should never have existed. Knowledge was power, and it still is to this day. Which is why these dark forces do not want you to know the truth about things like Stonehenge, or the truth about higher dimensions. But even back then, 6,000 BC, the leader was facing a rapidly changing situation on the planet. Other races were starting in defiance to come down and had their own agendas and plans for humanity on this planet and this physical plane. What he prized most and what gave him his edge was he was seen as the master of all that is dark. And so he needed somewhere to hide his knowledge. But understand this, humanity are good. Our birthright is light. And there are forces for good far greater than even this leader. And all those who are dark and evil work in the shadows. The thing they fear more than absolutely anything is the truth of what they are doing being brought into the light. And so they have to hide in secrecy, even if they hide in plain sight amongst us today. And so he needed somewhere where he could hide his dark knowledge, not only from his enemies and the other races and groups, and even from some of his own ranks, but from the light. And he took all of his knowledge and his understanding of the third dimension, and bearing in mind that the third dimension itself was under a dark firmament, which is why we're so kept in the dark about higher dimensions and the source of light. But he took all of this knowledge and he realised that Stonehenge presented a wonderful opportunity. You see, what he needed was a library, somewhere he could archive off all of his knowledge. And then when he was training his acolytes, he could send them to this secret library, and in secret they could gain the knowledge that he wanted them to have. And this brings us on to Avebury, and it's at Avebury that we will find this library.
Join me as we head north to Avebury, a straight line journey of just over 17 miles. There's much more to discover there, but first let's recap what we now know. About 9700 BC, a being of immense evil from higher dimensions instructed his agents on the third dimension, known as Druids, to make a giant year clock. Twice a year he came down to them by interdimensional tunnel, fueled by black magic and ungodly energy. As well as putting in place dark magic and energy grids, they also interfered and meddled with affairs on Earth in order to mislead and enslave humanity. 700 years later, he gave them technology to move giant stones, and they created the stone circles to facilitate interdimensional craft first seen on Atlantis thousands of years before. By BC 6000, some of his allies had turned against him, and other groups were interested in manipulating humanity, and so to keep his advantage, he sought to hide his evil knowledge in a library on the third dimension. Thus, the Avebury site was formed. Across this vast expanse of time, this leader and the other dark and evil races have all had a single goal: to prevent you from discovering your true nature as a being of light, and to stop you reaching for the source of that light. They want to keep you in the dark, and technology is the key to their success.
So we've just arrived at the southernmost part of the Avebury site, and these stones, one here and the one behind me, represent the entrance to what is a long gateway that you can see going off heading north to the stone circle. And we're going to walk, it's about 1 kilometre, and at the other end we should find the southern edge of the stone circle. Now these stones were brought here in exactly the same way as the Druids used technology to move the stones at Stonehenge. Now as we walk up here, it's about a kilometre. Good boy. And it'll obviously take me quite a few minutes. And you saw the drive on the way here as well. And that was obviously not as direct a route because we had to go around the roads. But even thousands of years ago when there were no roads, it would have still been quite a trek. Now you remember me saying that those visitors from higher dimensions only had a maximum really of 10 hours. And when I said that they created a library at Avebury, obviously they had to get there. Now they couldn't use the craft because the energy demands just to keep the craft at this dimension, at this vibration, were quite high. It was purely there to get them here and to take them home. So they had to make their way to Avebury. At the speed I'm going, it would have taken them the best part of half of that time. They wouldn't have really had the time to walk all the way here, do what they need to do and then walk back. The answer to this may be surprising, as how did they do it then? They didn't have any fancy technology, hoverboards, they didn't use horses. Because they were higher dimensional beings and because they had come down into what I call pseudo-physicality, although yes they were physical and you could interact with them, they didn't exist in the same physical way that you and I do. They were still fundamentally higher vibration. For them, there was no weight really, there was no strain, and they could literally run super fast because there was no effect upon them from that you and I would experience. They didn't fatigue, they simply left the craft, had a quick sprint up here and arrived minutes later, did what they need to do and then sprinted back to the craft, all with ample of time. You see, things on higher dimensions don't obey the laws of physics as we do, and they, although could interact with physical things and though they could be seen, they were not truly physical, they were just temporarily physical. So we're now arriving at the ring of the henge around Avebury, and as you come over this henge you can see the stones. This village wouldn't have been here in the past and this road through the middle, so you can kind of see a ring of stones, and again significantly big, and as before it's the same technology, exactly the same as Stonehenge, and that would later be used for the pyramids. It probably would have been quite something to have seen these circles and the outer henge when they were first erected. But now that there's this village in the middle of it, traffic driving past and trees growing up around it and within it, it's hard to get an idea of what it might have been. If viewed from above, you have one giant outer circle, the henge, and then you have two inner circles, and buried beneath the ground is also a rectangle, all made of stone. And this is quite an impressive stone. I'm 6 foot tall, and I come about yay high, so I'm guessing this is at least 10 foot above the ground. Wider at the top, so there's no way it landed there according to nature. Okay, this stone behind me is just one of the many stones at the Avebury site, forming two inner rings and then the outer ring. The inner rings are the library, as are the buried stones, forming a rectangle. When I said library, you may have been forgiven for thinking in terms of paper, ink and books, and ironically, just over there is a second-hand bookshop. But these are multi-dimensional beings from a higher dimension. They don't work in terms of ink and paper. For them, it's all about thought. So they needed a library of thought. And it turns out that the third dimension has something very, very special. It has silica, and in particular quartz. Now, all these rocks contain, even if it's just microscopic, they contain quartz crystals. And it turns out that quartz is perfect for storing thought. And if you talk to people who study crystals, they'll talk about programming crystals through intention. Intention is thought, and the crystals are able to trap data. Just as you would put information onto a USB stick, each one of these stones is actually a repository of thought and therefore information. Now, just as in a bookshop or in a library you would find different books on different subjects, that's what this is. Each stone covers a separate topic. Now, all the topics were concerned with things like dark magic, mind control, technology, basically things to do with suppressing humanity, controlling humanity, or general wrongdoing. And you may wonder, well, how did the information get into the stones? It's very simple. It started with the leader. He would come down, he would telepathically transmit the information he wanted into the stone, and then he would use an array of dark magic, invocations and incantations and spells to protect that information. That stone was now locked in place with its knowledge. Only someone that had the right incantations and invocations would be able to access that information. In time, not just the leader, but those close to him, such as Pan, also came down and imbued their knowledge into specific stones. And thus, a library of dark and evil knowledge was embedded into the physical matter at Avebury. Once the information was there, it was very straightforward for those who the leader intended, his acolytes, those he was training in the dark arts, to come here and access that information. He would say to them, take the next craft down at solstice and go to stone number 4, stone number 7 and stone number 14, for example. And he would give them the incantation to unlock each of the stones. They would sit in front of the stone using telepathy. They would do the incantation, which would unlock the knowledge, and then they would telepathically draw it to them. And they would then know at a thought level the knowledge of that stone. It was clever because in this way the leader made sure that only the information he wanted could be accessed by that person. Otherwise, if it wasn't for the protection in place, someone could come and they could gather all of the knowledge, and since knowledge is power, they would then be able to challenge the leader. So the leader kept the keys. He knew the incantations, the invocations necessary. No one else did. And that way he could train his students in the dark arts, but each one only had a small piece of the overall picture. They knew enough to do what he wanted them to do, but not to challenge him. Now, the protection wasn't just about protecting the knowledge in each stone. Remember, he hid the knowledge down here on the third dimension plane to keep it out of the light. And so the outer henge that's running behind us here and round there, and the stones around the perimeter acted as an anchor point for an energy grid, a dome, covering the entire site, shrouding it in darkness, and therefore keeping the light out. So this monumental construction is far from a sacred site. It is something far, far more nefarious. Probably one of the most condensed repositories of ungodly and evil energy, thought, knowledge, which has been used since 6000 BC when this was constructed to suppress humanity. to keep us literally in the dark.
When I finished filming, I was really saddened at the thought of all the evil and darkness that had been put into this land. I felt compelled to bless the ground and declare, as one who serves the light, that the forces of darkness could no longer claim this place. When I looked up, there was that wonderful rainbow which I just showed, and I knew there was nothing left to do or say here. What needed to be brought to light has been, and it was time to leave. The unexpected sunshine which had allowed me to film receded, and sure enough, just as I made it to the van, the rains came down with poetic timing.
Well, it looks like we're leaving Avebury just in time. Literally, just as I got to the van and sat down, the rain came. We were blessed there with the weather to actually be able to do some filming and not get completely soaked through. So we're, for the last time, going to head back to the Stonehenge campsite. Perhaps it's fitting though, as we leave Avebury behind us, that we talk about the downfall or the end of Stonehenge and the Druids. The library at Avebury, and indeed the airport at Stonehenge, served the leader well. But there is one constant, and that is change. And by 6000 BC, some of the races that had been allied with the leader, in particular the ones that are very technologically advanced, and other races were starting to come down and make their own colonies and bases on the third dimension. And those ones that broke rank from his alliance, he would in time attack their cities with his own armies. But he was losing control in some respects. And so by about 6000 BC, things were changing, and things had to evolve from his point of view as well. Technology was also changing. So by 400 BC, the site at Stonehenge no longer had significance to him. He'd built up a large presence in South America and was influencing the civilizations there, building a power base. But technology had changed as well, and there were more energy efficient, less energy consuming ways of bringing people down to the third dimension and returning them to higher dimensions. They still used the vortex technology to shift vibration, but the propulsion was something much more similar to what you might recognise as aircraft today. And indeed the craft that were developed round about 400 BC look a lot like the craft of today, and there are actually statues and amulets and things depicting what look like aeroplanes that have been found dating back to that period in South America. So this brings us to the time of the Nazca Lines. Stonehenge was no longer relevant, and we'll talk about what happened to Stonehenge and the Druids in a moment. But he moved his base of operations over to Peru, to the Nazca region. And when you look at the lines, it's just an evolution of what he'd done at Stonehenge. Using these new craft, which effectively flew rather than were propelled in the way that the saucers were, he built long runways for them to land. And even today, modern technology marvels at how it could have been possible for him to have these 7-mile long straight lines. It's simple. He used what we would understand to be laser technology to create these long straight lines, and then just manual labour to clear the terrain. So when you look at the Nazca Lines, there's 3 different structures that you see. There are long, straight, parallel tracks, which are the landing strips, literally the runways. Then there are animal glyphs. And remember back to the constellations, these animal glyphs, which are massive, represent the different races that he granted permission to use his runways. The bigger the glyph, the more important that race was in the alliance. And then the last of the structures that you see at Nazca are these massive geometric mandalas. The rain is really coming down. And these geometric mandalas are in effect the same as the stones that surround the perimeter of Stonehenge or Avebury. They're complex geometries into which are embedded black magic, forming large structures of energy and grids of energy over the region. They also act as anchor points for black magic, effectively anchor points for where the interdimensional tunnels would open so that these craft from higher dimensions could come through into the third dimension plane. So you simply have runways, flags effectively showing who's allowed, and black magic icons, and that's it. That's what the Nazca structures and lines are. And so by 400 BC he retired Stonehenge. Round about then was the last time that any interdimensional craft came down specifically to use Stonehenge in Avebury. And what happened to the Druids? They're just the lowest rung of the ladder. Amazingly, despite 9,000 years of investment, the leader didn't tell them, he just stopped coming. He stopped sending his envoys. And so, with no one coming down, the Druids didn't know what had happened. They simply followed orders. Every solstice they gathered in the hope that someone would arrive. They didn't know that things had changed. They were out of communication. Not knowing what to do, they just carried on doing what they had always done, what had been passed down for thousands of years. And so, over the next few hundreds of years, and indeed thousands of years, until quite recently, they passed down the Druid lore, the Druid knowledge that you gather at the solstice to receive instruction, to meet with the men who come from the stars. It's quite a sad state of affairs. Stonehenge fell into ruin. The true meaning behind gathering at the solstice got lost as it was passed down from generation to generation. And eventually it was just simply the lore of magic and the symbology of the stones. But there's more to it. The leader didn't want those left behind to remember. He made sure that the key bits of information were hidden in their minds. And remember, it's all about deception, it's all about smoke and mirrors. What a wonderful opportunity Stonehenge now represented to him. People would come, people would gather, people would ask questions, and people looking for the truth would find Stonehenge in the years and the decades and the centuries to come. And so he left it as a beacon of deception. When people came, they still gathered at the solstice, only now they didn't know why, but the legends about healing energy, which remember only really applies to those who are dark, and the legends about involvement with the stars and higher knowledge and beings and things, was enough to bring people along. And so, as well as the ancestors of the Druids and the bloodlines of these 12 races that continued, good people would come along. And so what the leader did was, at each solstice, he would open up the tunnel, the interdimensional tunnel, and he would release that ungodly energy into that site. Those people who were drawn to it because they were dark and negative would feel fantastic, they would feel uplifted. And so legend of the healing powers of the stones and of that place, and a feeling of awe would continue. But for those who were good, who had light within them, humanity, they wouldn't necessarily feel sick, but they would be open to mind control and suggestion and subliminal message. And so, as well as sending the energy which would kind of activate the lower animal parts of people, making them feel good, a bit like a drug makes people feel good so that they want more. The leader would use the opportunity that any good humans that were there would be, especially if they went into the ritual of dance and taking certain herbs and things, would be easy prey to distract them from the truth by putting thoughts and ideas into them to attract them to the dark arts, so that they would grow in their interest in things like geometry, magic, symbolism, chanting, witchcraft, and all of these things. It doesn't mean that the intention of the people there was bad, and quite often they had good intentions to heal. The road to ruin is paved with good intentions, as they say. And good people, people whose birthright is the light, have a natural inner yearning for something higher, but stuck under that dark firmament, it's like they've been cut off. And so they would go perhaps to Stonehenge, gather at the solstice with good intentions, and the leader would prey on them, corrupt their minds, fill them with ideas to tempt them into things that would take them away from the light. Doesn't mean that they were bad, it's just that people don't understand what's behind a lot of these things. And even if something feels good, even if something might have some kind of positive outcome in the short term, people don't always understand the cost. Yes, your body can be healed with certain practices, but not all healing is good. And what if the cost to gain something on the physical realm is to shut down something, your soul or your spirit, on higher dimensions? And this is what the leader and the Druids working towards, to keep humanity in the dark. And so, though he left Stonehenge to rack and ruin, he didn't leave its legacy. He made sure that it would carry on acting as something that beguiles people, that leads them astray because of the awe and wonder of this monument. And it's the same at Avebury. Even today, as I approached some of the stones, there were people deep in devotion with their hands and their forehead pressed against the stone. Perhaps they were there for healing or for power or for some kind of sacred ceremony, but they have no idea of the darkness and the evil that created those stones and what is locked within them. But more on that, because the story of the stones and Stonehenge has changed in recent years, and I'll talk about that towards the end. If only people knew the truth. And so I know that so many good people go to Stonehenge and Avebury with the best of intentions and quite often come away feeling good. In the book, I'll talk more about the origin of feelings. All I can say at this stage is, do not let feelings be your guide. How you feel is one of the easiest things for those on higher dimensions to manipulate. We're all too easily led by our feelings. The path of light, the path of truth, is a much higher path than the seeking of feeling good or even bliss. Even bliss itself is a dead end for the seeker of truth. There's no denying that Stonehenge, Avebury, the Nazca Lines, the pyramids, there's no denying that they're awe-inspiring, but they don't come close to the truth that can be revealed when we look beyond this physical realm. It's this truth, this greater truth, which is your birthright as a human being, that the leader, his druids, and the councils on all dimensions desperately want you to stay ignorant about.
So here we are, back where it all began. The documentary started here and we're nearly at the end. But the story of Stonehenge and Avebury are not actually finished yet. I'll tell you how they end shortly. I've touched on a number of things, including beings from other dimensions, interdimensional craft, magic, and all of these things are actually just a small fragment of a much, much bigger picture. And this bigger picture is all about you. My own interest in Stonehenge only came about because I found out who was behind it, who founded the Druids. And it was this leader who's behind so many other things that even now shape your life. And he has always had one purpose, one goal as far as you're concerned, and that is to keep you in the dark about your birthright. Your birthright is the light. And he doesn't want you as a human being to know the truth. And it was in pursuit of spiritual truth that I discovered who he was, and that led me to investigating more about Stonehenge. This truth that the leader wants to keep you in the dark about is about your spiritual birthright. And this is what I've been researching tirelessly for a long, long time, and that's what led me to the leader, and that's what ultimately led me here to Stonehenge. And in the books that I'm writing, I go into a lot of detail about this bigger picture, talking much more about the positive and the spiritual side of things, what really is on higher dimensions, and how this all relates to you. The books that I'm writing aren't being written so that I can profit from them. When they're finally published, they're going to be published at a not-for-profit price, so that they're as accessible to as many people as possible. On my website, all that I've done, the podcasts, the videos, the articles, it's freely available. I don't charge anything. I don't even ask people to subscribe. I just want to get the truth out there. And like many others who serve the light, we're trying to let people know about how much they are in the dark. I don't want you to just believe what I'm saying. I want you to be inspired by this documentary, just as Stonehenge is inspiring to so many people. I want you to be inspired to ask questions, to start to find out more for yourself. It's all about choice, but we can't make choices unless we learn and understand what the choices are. As I said, the story of Stonehenge and Avebury is not yet finished. You may be wondering what happened to the black magic that they imbued into these stones and the dark and esoteric knowledge hidden at Avebury, and also the interdimensional tunnel that came from over that way. Because of the diligence and hard work of those that serve the light, not just on this dimension but on our other dimensions, all of these things have been destroyed. Once they became known, they could be dealt with. And so all of that hidden knowledge, the black magic, even the ungodly energy has all been removed. And so what we're looking at here are just inert stone. And the same is true of Avebury and the other sites around the world. This doesn't mean that those that would do this kind of thing have been completely dealt with and are no more. On higher dimensions, the leader and others still exist and still interfere and meddle in the affairs of the third dimension. They've had thousands of years to lay the groundwork and to put in place organisations and infrastructure. But now that these things are known about, and I don't just mean down here, then they can be more easily dealt with and overcome. And the truth is that right now, as a human being, you have probably never been so free. What remains is to decide, what do you want to do with this freedom? Firstly, I'd like to say thank you for watching this documentary. We're back in the campsite near Stonehenge, and as you can see, the sun is setting. I was just talking to the owner of the campsite, and he asked me what I've been doing, and I said I've been filming a documentary, and naturally he asked, well, what's the documentary about? I'll leave you to answer that. What have you taken from this documentary? What do you think this is about? Because it's all about what it means to you. But there's one last thing. In a week's time, a whole load of people are going to descend on Stonehenge, and many of them will identify as being Druids. Probably most of them have no idea about the leader or the information I've shared with you in this video. What I need to really make clear, the word Druid, and this word has evolved in its pronunciation, now covers a much wider spectrum than what I'm referring to when I talk about the original Druids. For example, and again I talk about this in the book, in Lindisfarne 2,000 years ago, there were wonderful, intelligent, kind people who lived in harmony with nature, and they would have been known as Druids. In other places, there were people who identified as Druid, because Druid eventually became a word synonymous with anyone who is intelligent, who gathers knowledge, who has wisdom. In other words, it could be a wise old man. And so the word Druid now does not mean what I was referring to in the past. And I wanted to make that clear, because whatever people's beliefs are, it fundamentally comes down to, do you pursue the light or do you pursue darkness? And so that choice between light and dark is a choice for everyone. It's a choice for you right now. So whatever you identify with, whether you consider yourself spiritual or not, whether you consider yourself a Druid or not, these are just labels. Only you can really know what's in your heart. And if anything, I hope all I've done is made you aware that there may be choices that have yet to be made. It's a wake-up call to understand the ancient history behind these things. Is it more important to identify as a Druid, or is it more important to connect inside with light, with love, and with the source of all of that great oneness?
that goes by other names. That's really what this is about. Peace be with you.